There's been a little bit of miscommunication about who turns on the projector. So we're all set, but we don't have a projection. So somebody's going to fix this hopefully soon, but we will just start. And I also hope that in the live stream people can hear us, so we'll just improvise a little bit. But I'll first give the floor to Michiel. I hope you can read that.
Yeah, kind of. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Michiel Koolman. I'm the co-chair of the Workplace Pride board, and I also lead one of the communities, which is Academia at Workplace Pride. And it is this community which is kind of co-organizing with Jojanneke van der Toorn this great event here. So a warm welcome, great that you could all come. It's going to be the hottest day of September. I don't feel it yet, but you never know. Certainly the topic is very hot. Let me talk a bit more with my hat as chair of Workplace Pride, and at the end you'll hear me again more from the Academia at Workplace Pride perspective. So I've been chair for 5 years, and 5 years is a short period, but if I'd been standing here 5 years ago, I would have given a very upbeat story about the state of our LGBTIQ+ community. I would say countries are decriminalizing laws around homosexuality. I'll talk about same-sex marriage, which is being embraced in more countries. I will talk about the acceptance of being LGBTIQ+ is going up and up in society. 5 years, actually, lots of things changed. So today, our situation is far from rosy. If we look in the political situation, we see that the radical right has been extremely strong in many, many elections. And that doesn't bode very well for us. And if you think, well, that's in the political bubble, so why should we worry about that? Well, think about a research that has been done not long ago among high school students in the Netherlands and how much they feel LGBTIQ+ is acceptable. Well, that number plummeted in a couple of years. So it's worrisome. Does it mean that my story is only doom and gloom? Not so much, because if you look at the workplace, actually we see a continued commitment from organizations there. Whether they are commercial companies, whether they are public organizations, whether they are research organizations or academic organizations. And if you look at Workplace Pride, our membership in this 5 years has almost doubled. So we started maybe at 75, and soon we'll be 150 members. And these members are increasingly active. And one way we measure that is through our global benchmark, a very powerful tool, and I'll talk about it at the end as well. So, and what is also very important, of course, is that what we do at Workplace Pride is well anchored in the academic community. So, I have to change. Okay. Very good. I hope you can still hear me. So we're very happy to have Jojanneke van der Toorn as our chair, which is the Workplace Pride chair. And every year we organize this event, our annual event around LGBT workplace inclusion and the research in that area. And we have 2 excellent keynote speakers, which Jojanneke is going to introduce shortly after she solved all the technical problems, but I'll just keep talking. We have Erin Cech, who's actually flew in from the US to give a keynote, and of course our very own Jojanneke van der Toorn will talk about hetero-professionalism, whether that's the norm in the world of the workplace or not. And it's almost ready.
I'm really sorry about this.
Yeah, don't worry. Well, maybe I can talk a little bit more about Academia at Workplace Pride. So we've seen more and more universities embrace LGBT workplace inclusion. They become active members. We've seen research organizations. I look at Christine, but I definitely should mention UNL, which is, I think, our latest addition to our family, which is a small organization, but of course a very powerful one. They sit there in the middle, representing all Dutch universities, so we're very happy to have UNL there. And of course, if I look at the universities, we have Leiden, LUMC, Tilburg, Rotterdam, Delft. Yeah, I see the Delft people. Erasmus Rotterdam, Twente, Saxion, Utrecht, Hogeschool Utrecht. etc., etc. So a great group. I was just going to say also research organizations, so we're very happy. And of course, one of the premier research organizations in the Netherlands is TNO, so TNO. So that's excellent as well. And you could not do research without funding, and thank God also NWO is a member of Academia at Workplace Pride as well. So we get together on a regular basis. Maybe I'll just do a little bit for my ends already now.
Yeah, please do,
Yeah, okay. We organize regular events. And what is, I think, key topics for us, what I hear from the academic members, is, for instance, how about self-ID? How do I deal with like a registration of identity in the university systems? I hear stories about what we would call HR issues, with all respect. So rainbow families, transition leave, how do we deal with all those issues? And I think it's very good that we can learn from each other there. Some universities are a little bit ahead of others, so how can we kind of push that agenda all together much better? One way to really do that, and I kind of alluded to that already, is our global benchmark. Oh, and I think I see some images behind me. The global benchmark from Workplace Pride is a very powerful tool. You can, of course, benchmark how are you doing today compared to your peers, but you can also really use this as a way to track the improvement and to guide you to kind of improve LGBT workplace inclusion in a very structured way year after year. And now I think I give the floor to Jojanneke, who has been improvising
so good at improvising.
Well.
I'm really sorry, Michiel. Thank you. This hasn't happened before. Normally it just works. But I'm really happy to see everyone here. We do this on a yearly basis. I see many familiar faces, but also new ones. So thank you to all of you for coming. We've concocted a nice program for today. As Michiel already shared, we have a really wonderful lineup today, people from academia and from practice, and that is also reflected in the audience. So that is really wonderful because it's something that I aim to do in my chair as LGBTIQ+ Workplace Inclusion Professor. Following the symposium, we will also, of course, network and talk. We have more coffee and more tea and treats in the Beeldentuin. I already want to point out to not miss the BIPLUS Workplace Inclusion exhibition, which is a series of portrait stories that are excerpts from interviews that we did with BIPLUS people about their experiences at work. And BIPLUS people are people who are attracted to people of more than one gender. Now, a few housekeeping notes. This symposium is being recorded. A very messy start, especially for those online, I think. If you want to ask questions, wait, I think, till after each talk and then raise your hand. Paula or Hao will come to you with a microphone. Please, of course, use respectful language at all times. If you want to communicate, then please consider including these hashtags and tags. And also, just to make you aware, there is a gender-inclusive restroom downstairs, which is a new thing. It didn't used to be the case, but it is, of course, a little bit in the margins. So you'll have to cross the courtyard, back outside to the other building, and then by the dining room, there is one. And we're still working on getting one right here in the main part of the building. But I want to point it out for those who prefer it. Now, the headline act. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Erin Cech to you from the University of Michigan. Erin's work really inspired me. It was already there when I started this chair, and it really was one of the few academic pieces, I think, that in related fields, so sociology, whereas I'm a social psychologist, really focused on the barriers that LGBTIQ+ people experience in the workplace. And all my students have, of course, read, especially Cech and Waitsuna's paper. It's one of those important pieces that form the basis of the work that we do. So it's really an honor to have you here today. Just a little bit of a biography. Erin's research examines the cultural mechanisms of inequality reproduction, and specifically how inequality is reproduced through processes that are not so overt and that are not so coercive, perhaps, at first sight, but that are under the surface and that really perpetuate this innocuous cultural beliefs and practices that maintain inequality. She investigates these mechanisms through a variety of methods, combining both qualitative and quantitative research, which is quite special because a lot of us in specific disciplines are trained in just one of these two. So that's a wonderful mixed method approach. Her research has been published in many academic, high-quality outlets that are widely read, and that is, of course, very important, and has been cited also in the popular press. For example, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. So people really get to know what she works on and the topics that we all here find very important. So it's not surprising that she achieved the highest honor in her university, the Henry Russell Award for early to mid-career scientists. And I think that once you've heard her speak, you'll agree that this is really much deserved. So please, a warm applause to Erin Cech.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Workplace Pride for inviting me out and sponsoring my presentation here. It's really wonderful to be in this space of scholars and organizational representatives thinking hard about these topics in a deep way and in a reflexive way. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is sort of in two parts. So first, I'm going to talk about the contours of LGBTQIA inequality, and how that plays out in the context of science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM fields in particular, as a sort of illustrative case. We can learn a lot from what's going on in science and tech that I think can be extended and amplified in other places. I'll talk a little bit about intersectional patterns. It's really important, of course, to understand and think about how those things manifest in various ways across different intersecting identities. And then I want to talk about some of the rhetorics of resistance for thinking about diversity promoting change. We are in a moment in the US, also it sounds like in the Netherlands, where there is increasing resistance to work that has been going on for decades to think critically about how to advance DEI and diversity related efforts. So I want to articulate some of those rhetorics of resistance with the idea that if you hear them and can label them, that gives you some platform for being able to push back on them. Okay, so the first space I want to talk about is the contours of LGBTQIA workforce inequality. So as we know, equality in this space has advanced unevenly. So in some places, in maybe federal or local level policies and organizational policies, we have better policies about equity or equity promoting change than we had maybe a decade or two ago. This is absolutely the case in the United States. It's certainly the case in many parts of Europe as well. But we also know that that advancement on the formal policy front is also matched with differences in persistent cultural biases against sexual minorities and transgender and gender non-binary persons. And there's persistent evidence of formal discrimination and exclusion. So, for example, about 11% of LGBTQ identifying workers in the US report being denied promotion at some point in their career. 39% report having experienced harassment at some point in their career trajectory, and 46% of transgender and gender non-binary individuals report difficulty getting or keeping a job. Much of the work in the space of LGBTQIA plus inequality has focused on experiences of social devaluation and marginalization in the workplace, right? Asking about who doesn't feel included in the informal social networks, who doesn't get invited to coffee or out to lunch with their colleagues, and the ways that that can perpetuate disadvantages. And although that's certainly an important piece to think about, it's not the full story. We have to understand also how there are spaces of inequality that's promoted through professional devaluation, how the work that LGBTQIA plus workers are doing is itself devalued because of who is doing it. And that's in part the space of the work that I want to talk about today. So I've conducted a lot of research that's funded by the National Science Foundation, and one of the projects I've done is called the STEM Inclusion Study. And this is a study of a broad set of STEM professionals in the United States, and I'll talk about what the sample is in a minute to give you a sense of who's actually in these data. But I focus in my work in broad sense on the experiences of professionals in the workplace, and in particular in STEM. So professional workers are actually a really important place to think about these topics of inequality, because they're the spaces that are supposed to align with these kind of liberal egalitarian norms of equal treatment, as opposed to sometimes the blue-collar and service sector workplaces. And so we want to understand what's going on there, because it likely has tentacles in a lot of other places. And I like to focus on STEM in particular because it is a place that prides itself on not being biased, on being objective and neutral, right? It's a place where who you are and who you love isn't supposed to matter for your ability to do the work and do the work well and have the work recognized. So if we see these kinds of biases here in the kinds of processes or articulate, it's likely that they exist in many other places in the professional workforce. So I conducted this STEM inclusion study with the goal of producing a large enough sample that I could really carefully understand the experiences of LGBTQ identifying STEM professionals compared to otherwise similar non-LGBTQ persons, really to try and isolate what that LGBTQ effect might be. And this is important for academic reasons, but also important for policy reasons. So what I'll present on today are data from over 25,000 full-time STEM professionals in the United States, over 1,000 of whom identify as LGBTQ. And LGBTQ is the acronym that I use for the study. I can talk more about how we delineated identity. We went through a very sort of complex process of testing and sort of a multi-level question process of getting into that identity. But for my talk, I'll be referencing this group as LGBTQ. The data are from samples of members of 21 professional societies and organizations in the U.S. This includes, for example, 8 national flagship societies in the natural and physical sciences, 5 flagship societies in engineering, and some interdisciplinary societies as well. Through a long, drawn-out process that I won't bore you with today, I worked with the leadership of these professional societies to distribute their email to the survey to their emails to either the full or random sample of the organization members. What I'm going to present to you in the next few slides are graphs that represent LGBTQ persons and non-LGBTQ persons. And what these graphs do is hold constant variability along other axes. So variability by race, ethnicity, by education level, by the sector they work in, by what kind of STEM field they're in, how much experience they have, all that kind of thing. So that when we look at differentials, it's really isolating that LGBTQ effect in the data. Okay. So one of the questions I get asked by skeptics in this space often is, well, are LGBTQ professionals really as qualified as non-LGBTQ professionals? Are they really as dedicated to their work as non-LGBTQ persons are? And what I find first and foremost is no, there's no significant differences in education level by LGBTQ status and no significant difference in the hours worked per week. So it's not a qualification issue or a hard work issue. It's also not a work dedication issue. So for example, LGBTQ persons are not less likely to be willing to put in a great deal of effort beyond what's required of their work, or are not differently likely to say that the specific work that they engage in is an important part of their professional identity. So we can't attach the kinds of disadvantages I'll talk about in a second to differentials in this space. So I noted that a lot of the research in this space has talked about experiences of social marginalization in the workplace. And what I want to talk about in the next few slides are professional devaluation, lack of professional opportunities. So for example, I find that compared to their otherwise similar non-LGBTQ peers, LGBTQ persons are more likely to report that they have limited opportunities to develop their skill, and they're less likely to say that their talents are used well in the workplace and that they have sufficient resources to get their job done. I included a QR code here that will link you to the study itself that has all the information and lots more figures and information for you if you want more. Third, I'm interested in whether LGBTQ professionals are more likely to be professionally discredited. So your professional knowledge is your currency as a professional. And if you don't have workers or coworkers that value your professional expertise, that can be extremely problematic for your career. And yet I find that LGBTQ persons are significantly more likely than their colleagues to believe that their colleagues think that they're less productive than they actually are, and to worry that their mistakes are more noticeable, and to feel like they have to work harder than their colleagues to be perceived as a legitimate professional. LGBTQ persons are also less likely to say that their colleagues treat them as equally skilled professionals, and are less likely to say that they are held at the same standard as others for promotion. As those who are part of organizations know, issues of retention and turnover are key. They're key for the quality of our workplaces, and they're key for our ability to have a healthy bottom line in our organizations. And what I find along these lines is that LGBTQ professionals are significantly more likely to intend to leave. So the LGBTQ persons are less likely to say that they're willing to stay in their STEM profession for the rest of their career, and are more likely to have thought about leaving their job. These are folks that have their full training in STEM, they're employed in sort of highly prestigious, high-paying STEM jobs, and yet they're more likely to think about leaving than their non-LGBTQ colleagues. And one of the things that we're interested in this paper is, to what extent is there connection between the kind of treatment people experience in their workplaces and their intentions to leave? And through the statistical analyses, we found that part of that difference by LGBTQ status in the intentions to want to leave their job is due in part to those experiences of negative treatment in the workplace, that they have less worker support and resources and experience devaluation more often. But it's not just an effect of LGBTQ status that we have negative experiences in terms of professional opportunities and respect, but these are things that likely run deeper. And we wondered finally, excuse me, the extent to which this gets under people's skin. So finally we asked, do professionals have more negative health and wellness outcomes compared to their non-LGBTQ peers? Thank you so much. And we find that this is the case. So compared to otherwise similar peers, LGBTQ persons experience minor health problems more often, experience insomnia more often, and experience stress from work more often than their non-LGBTQ peers. And LGBTQ persons experience depressive symptoms more often than their non-LGBTQ peers as well. And so, like with turnover intentions, we find that those negative experiences at work contribute in part to those more negative health and wellness outcomes. That part of the reason there are these negative health and wellness outcomes are because they have these negative experiences at work. It's important to understand some of the differences underneath the LGBTQ umbrella. So I'll mention some of the ways that this is patterned intersectionally. So a long literature that has found that transgender and gender non-binary persons often experience particularly acute patterns of disadvantage in the workplace. We find that transgender and gender non-binary respondents are more likely to experience minor health problems, stress, and depressive symptoms compared to their cisgender sexual minority peers. We find along the lines of gender inequality in these spaces that LGBTQ identifying women are more likely than LGBTQ identifying men to experience professional devaluation and harassment. And finally, that LGBTQ identifying people of color are more likely than their white LGBTQ peers to experience professional devaluation and harassment. So to sort of sum up the findings of this particular part of the study, we can say that LGBTQ professionals experience more devaluation, more marginalization, fewer professional opportunities, and have higher turnover intentions than similar non-LGBTQ professionals, even though they are equally qualified and dedicated to their work. In other research, I've looked at the ways that this operates intersectionally by gender, race, ethnicity, disability status, etc. And I think it's important to point out that even though privileges and disadvantages play out intersectionally in the workforce, that LGBTQ status is in and of itself an important axis of disadvantage. That regardless of their intersectional positions, LGBTQ professionals have more negative experience than non-LGBTQ peers who share their race, their gender, and their disability status. So we are part of organizations that, at least on their surface, want to do something about this, want to make positive change. And there's organizations and professions across Europe, across the United States, who are interested in promoting these egalitarian ideals. But in these contexts, where we're supposed to have these egalitarian ideals, how do people express their opposition? What are the narratives they use to do so? My argument is that we need to understand the landscape of these rhetorics of resistance in order for us to know what we're encountering and how then to push back on them. So today I want to talk about 4 rhetorics of resistance that are common in resistance to DEI efforts. This is in the case of STEM specifically, but I think you'll see it resonates in many other spaces as well. So the first rhetoric of resistance is one that probably is the most common, makes the most sense in terms of things that we've heard about opposition to DEI efforts, and that's the idea of outgroup bias. And in outgroup bias, the idea is that people will resist DEI efforts because they believe the groups these efforts are meant to serve are less deserving of inclusion or advancement. So I'll provide an example quote or two for each of these that come from open-ended survey data from intersectionally privileged STEM professionals talking about their resistance to DEI efforts. So for example, this respondent wrote, "Diversity to support aberrant behavior, LGBTQ, is a sin and will ultimately result in the destruction of society and will fail the individual that takes shelter in their aberration. I fully support that there should be no discrimination based on race, ethnicity, male, female, or religion. I do object to having aberrant behavior forced into the workplace under the flag of diversity." So here, the respondent is opposing DEI efforts that are LGBTQ inclusive because this person holds very overt anti-LGBTQ bias. The second rhetoric that this opposition can rest on is what's often called in the literature in-group threat. And this is the idea, especially for those who are intersectionally privileged, that any kind of efforts are going to threaten one's own position. And sometimes this is called, in broader parlance, reverse discrimination. So here, it's the belief that inclusion and workplace opportunities are a zero-sum game. That to resist DEI efforts means to protect one's own privilege and the privilege of one's in-group. So for example, one respondent wrote, "There are plenty of mechanisms and interest in preventing gender bias against females, but almost nothing focused on or interested in gender bias against males. I'm beginning to see and experience bias against males from females in positions of power in hiring, firing, promotion decisions, and everyday work environment. I know many men who experience hostility from a group of well-organized females." The third and fourth, I'm not quite sure what well-organized females looks like or means, but nonetheless. The third and fourth are ones that are more subtle, right? They're ones that don't necessarily read on their surface as anti-DEI, but function in this way nonetheless. The first is what I call the idea of being immune from prejudice. So this is the idea that the objectivity and logic of the organization or the profession acts as a firewall to social bias. There might be social bias out there, but we're different here, right? We're protected from that kind of narrative. So for example, a respondent wrote, "I think our training in logic prevents us from discriminating on the basis of irrelevant factors, race, gender, quite effectively. I'm open to correction on that, but in 25 years, I've yet to see it happen." The second example quote is, "I don't make special efforts aimed at inclusion. I don't see incidents of discrimination, and I am glad to be in a technical area where, at least in my opinion, there is less of a problem than many make it out to be. I feel that most engineers and scientists look at a person's competence and abilities and not their skin color, gender, etc. So the idea here is that we don't have to worry about bias because we're logical, right? We're systematic. And finally is the idea I have called in other work depoliticization. And this is the belief broadly that many professional spaces, STEM in particular, not only can be stripped of cultural and social concerns, but they must be. That the only way we can do objective, neutral, pure work is if we remove those considerations in their entirety. And of course, questions of equity and inclusion are seen as potentially polluting to these sort of pure epistemic spaces in these professional contexts. And so one respondent, and this is actually an excerpt from an email I received from an intersexually privileged person. I've received 200 or 300 of these emails over the course of the last 5 or 10 years of people in the public just not liking what I'm doing in their research in this space. And this person wrote, "All I can contribute to your purposes is my passionate belief that scientific research needs to maintain its blazing hot focus on the particular problems under study. Diluting this approach by other concerns like diversity will proportionally devalue and retard the primary goal of science. Leave science to its own culturally important, even crucial purposes. Please do not seek to weaken these in the service of social concerns, however virtuous or profitable." So in these rhetorics of resistance, those first two, out-group bias and in-group preference, are relatively easy to spot. You sort of know them when you see them or when you hear them. But when opposition to DEI efforts gets framed at protecting the work itself, protecting the integrity, the purity, the quality of the work that's being done in an organization or in a department, it's really difficult to see for many people, and especially difficult to address. Because when you try to address them, people think you're undermining the quality of the work itself. So the most powerful rhetorics of resistance, I argue, are those that have the patina of objectivity and product integrity and don't actually invoke biased beliefs or social groups at all. So how do we challenge these rhetorics of resistance? The sort of bad news is, because we're just starting to articulate them, we don't have a really good sense, especially for these latter two, of what to do about them. But I will give a few suggestions of how to undermine them. What we know from the literature is that when we articulate in a social space issues of inequality or discrimination, and those are articulated by people who are highly respected, that message is more likely to land. One of the most difficult things to do in these spaces is to convince privileged people that there's a problem at all. And so having somebody who is respected in these spaces say, you know what, we've got a problem here, that can move the conversation forward. Secondly, is making sure that we attempt to make LGBTQIA+ identity a relevant topic of conversation across the board in our organization. Oftentimes, these conversations are relegated to side rooms, metaphorically or actually, or committees. And those committees do their work on the side. They may report back to leadership, but they do so in a very contained way. And there's little conversations in the workplace broadly on how these kinds of inequalities operate. And so we have to, I think anytime we have a feeling, a sort of gut feeling, that there are places in our organization where it would feel especially wrong or sort of inappropriate to bring up topics of LGBTQIA inequality, those are exactly the places that need those conversations the most. Third, there's opportunities, I think, to take information that's happening within organizations and help people to problem solve about them together. So what some of the literature has shown is that when people are part of problem identification and problem solution, they're more invested in what's going on in those spaces. So for example, employee resource groups or LGBTQIA networks could gather anonymized testimonials to make sure that they protect confidentiality and set them in front of leaders or other organization members and say, first of all, why do you think this happens? What is actually going on here? And what do we do about it? Right, to engage people who are in organizational positions of power to think about the problem solving in that realm. And finally, what we know is that we can't solve this by changing hearts and minds, right? This isn't something that we can rely on people just being less biased in a few more years addressing this problem. We have to change our policies and practices in our organizations to make them more equitable. For example, one of the things that we know is incredibly effective for hiring and promotion is the use of rubrics and the holding people accountable in their decisions to those use of rubrics. The final point I will leave you with today is that we have to look out for and address anti-DEI sentiments that are expressed by organization members and leaders without using anti-diversity bias. With that, I'll leave you to Q&A. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Erin, for your wonderful presentation. I'm a huge fan of your book, Misconceiving Meritocracy. As we all know, like academia, people say that it runs purely on meritocracy. Given the inequalities in LGBTQ communities or like all the other communities, how we can alleviate the inequalities when we talk about like when we already have issues with the collaborations, less citations, and combining this with promotion criteria, it becomes a huge problem. And in your study, which, you had surveyed almost like 1,000 participants who belong to our community. And how many of them are belonging to the universities? You studied STEM in general. Maybe like with respect to university perspective, could you please elaborate something, especially with the collaboration issues and all our promotion related challenges?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. So we had about a third of the sample of LGBTQ identifying folks that were part of universities. And so some of them were employed in sort of research intensive institutions. Some of them were 2-year institutions or more vocational schools. So we had variability along those lines as well. We didn't see substantial differences in these patterns, unfortunately. And in some cases, we did find that these differentials were actually worse in academia than they were in industry. And we attribute that to just a greater variability in industry for the kinds of climates that LGBTQ workers are experiencing. Some organizations are fantastic and some are really, really problematic. So there's a greater space of variability. And I think it's challenging because in academia in particular, there is this really profound commitment to epistemic purity, right? That we are doing work in our departments, and anytime you're bringing in considerations that are outside of, issues of kind of publications or grants or things, that somehow that might be, disadvantaging people in other ways. And so, depending on the sort of departmental context in academia, I think having open-ended conversations that invite people to critique and undercut the idea that STEM is, or that academia is actually a meritocracy is super helpful. So starting out conversations like, well, we've all tried to publish something before and came to the conclusion that there was just a political decision that was made by the reviewer or by the editor that was not part of meritocracy, right? Everybody has stories that they can point to say, actually, STEM isn't as meritocratic as we thought, and then lead into conversations about what if you didn't have the same opportunities to have those kinds of collaborations because of points of bias or exclusion? What would that mean for one's CV? So thinking about it in this sort of abstract way like that, I think can lead decision-making bodies, particularly hiring committees, to think of it a little bit more strategically around that. I think in addition to that, when hiring is made, when decisions of promotion are made in the context of committees, anytime the word fit is used or any of those kinds of slippery ideas, that has all kinds of biases that can creep into that. So anytime people are using that kind of language, the question is, what do you mean? In what ways? To try and bring it to a concrete space, because the idea, so many of the ways that LGBTQ exclusion operates in the workplace through hiring and promotion is the sense that, well, maybe this person doesn't belong in our department. Maybe this person doesn't belong in a leadership role. They don't feel right for that. And that feeling is, all kinds of invitation for biases to creep in. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you for the remarkable research you've done. And it's also very applicable to the Dutch academia, I think, this research, because we have this saying, "do normaal," especially in the faculty in the university I work in. And I also work as a diversity policy officer. So while I have critiques on this concept, DEI, so I do have two questions. There are more critical scholars that really thinks that we should denote this term DEI, and I was wondering your stance on this, or do you think it's still an opportunity to raise LGBTQIA+ issues and rights? And I also was wondering if you look at the role of leadership in this research, and how does that influence DEIs? Yeah. So.
Excellent. Thank you for your question. So we'll answer the second one first. So we have data on whether or not they were managers and whether they were sort of second level and third level managers as well. And we didn't really find much difference there. In some ways there was an expectation that that they would have a little bit of a different perspective because they're in the space of managing people. They're a little bit more aware of what's going on in the nuances of the people's lives that they are overseeing. And there might be greater expectations to follow along with diversity-related efforts. And that really wasn't the case. It wasn't a positive or a negative in this space. With the issue of DEI, that's something I really grapple with a lot. I really am aligned with the deep critique of DEI as an approach generally, as an idea of being the thing that's going to solve it, right? These ideas that I've talked about are so deeply embedded in the professional cultures themselves that in order for us to address them, we have to undermine the very idea of what it means to be a professional in its entirety. And that's a really difficult thing to do, and it's going to take a long time. And the pragmatist in me says, I need to work within the structure of the institutions that I have available to me. I need to understand what is possible in a space, because it's sort of like that analogy that if I'm trying to skip a rock across a little pond, that I might skip it entirely, right? That somebody is not going to engage, someone's not going to listen to me if I am asking for the moon and they're not willing to budge an inch. And it's been a calibration for me in my whole career of saying, I recognize DEI is not a panacea. There's all kinds of stuff that goes wrong with that, and it is a deep, deep problem. But in many of our organizations and institutions, that's sort of all we've got, especially if we are sort of individuals or small groups that are trying to work. And so trying to at least make those efforts not openly opposed is in some ways, a step forward.
Okay. Thank you. This was really a great talk. I enjoyed a lot. I have a question, kind of a comment. So in a way, I'm wondering whether maybe diversity resistance is not the biggest issue. And let me say why. So first, we know diversity resistance occurs each time organizations change. Each time there is a change, people resist. Yeah. Second, I think diversity resistance shows that those practices work and that the privileged people feel the tension, so in a way it's good news. And third, I think it's also good news because it forces organizations to change their policies and include those resistances into the practice itself. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, so what do you think about, I think diversity fatigue might be a more problematic issue, because here we have, let's say, disadvantaged employees getting disengaged from the policy, believing it's just instrumental. So yeah, I was wondering, what do you think about this, and whether do you see some diversity fatigue rhetoric as well in your studies? Thank you.
That's a great question. And absolutely that's there. I think that anytime you have a sustained DEI initiative that's really pushed by organizations and done so in a way that's window dressing and not necessarily actually trying to actively advance structural change, you're going to have diversity fatigue, and it's going to be disadvantageous often for the groups who all of a sudden are expected to have representation on all these committees, but they're not supported, and that service work in academia, for example, is not valued and recognized, et cetera. For me, the thing that I'm really interested in is the idea of how DEI efforts and other equity advancing approaches can be pushed back on through the language that's already has cultural legitimacy in an organization or in a profession. And that feels to me particularly dangerous. And so it might not be resistance to DEI specifically, but it might just be resistance to like thinking about inequality in general that is promoted by, especially those second two rhetorics. And so we have, especially in academia, this expectation for, zero tolerance for, bigoted statements or, structures that are supposed to be, equity promoting and behaviors that are not tolerated. What are the things that are flying under that radar that are doing the same work and probably doing it more effectively? What are those kind of cultural ideologies that we need to pay attention to that are just sort of happening in plain sight? And that's sort of what I'm trying to focus on for those latter two. Thanks.
Hi. You were talking a lot about academia, which is fine because STEM and academia is like, but I was interested to know if there were any differences in equality per sector within STEM. So, for instance, I work for a pharma company, and I was very interested because I know that the difference, like with merit, we have a similar thing with merit, but there's other things with the politicization. And I wanted to know if there were differences within the sectors, and also if there was differences within intersectionalities of LGBTQI. So then specifically neurodivergency, because that's like one of the things that crept into DEI that nobody really knows what to do with, Anyway, those were my two questions.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. So to talk about the latter question first, I have some colleagues that are doing some really exciting work on inequity along neurodivergency and the way that operates intersectionally. So stay tuned for that. I think it'll be really cool. In our work, we just didn't have sufficient sample size to be able to really disentangle that in a way that we felt comfortable presenting the data that didn't undermine confidentiality, right? This was such a dance because the sample sizes were really small in some spaces, right? Which is indicative of the very problem that we're trying to address. And so that becomes a big challenge. Overall, we found the same patterns across sector, across both employment sector and STEM subfield. To your point about pharma, one of the places where LGBTQ and equity was actually strongest was in the life sciences and industry, right? And part of that has to do with a really essentialized notion of like LGBTQ status and identity and all that stuff that I think is particularly acute in the life sciences. And it's also the place, at least in the US context, that they see that they feel like they take pride in having gone the furthest distance because they have the greatest representation of white heterosexual women. Like it's a sense of like, oh, we're getting it figured out. Like look at our rosters, look at our ranks. And so I think there's a lot going on there. But in terms of the playing out of these different ideologies, it's quite consistent across STEM subdisciplines and employment sectors. And I would say the social sciences are probably involved in a lot of this stuff too. So we'll see. Great. Thank you so much for your great questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That was exactly what I was hoping for. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we do in my research group, and I'll go through it a little bit quicker than I had anticipated and also not allow any questions. So I hope you do stick around for the coffee and tea and we can talk a little bit more then. Also, Erin will, of course, hold on for a bit longer for you to ask questions. So we've just heard already about many of the barriers that LGBTQ plus people experience in the workplace. Just doing a small resizing here. And one of the things that we work on in our research group is the manifestation of this bias in the form of heteroprofessionalism. Sounds very complicated, this term, but you'll be, if you are part of Workplace Pride, you'll be hearing more about this as it's really a focus of research in our group. So in many, or in workplace contexts, professionalism is generally encouraged. But what is considered professional is subjective and often really shaped by those in dominant positions, like cisgender straight men, white straight men. This leads to the belief and the prescriptive norm, so the prescriptive norm, that to be professional is to be cisgender and straight, as relevant to what we're talking about today. And consequently also to the labeling of LGBTIQ plus identities as unprofessional and as inappropriate for the workplace context. Now, heteroprofessionalism can really be seen as a sort of manifestation of assimilation ideology, so conforming to the norm, where people really are expected to fit a particular mold. And I always really like this picture because it shows it so nicely what the issue is here. Assimilationism is a specific form of identity blindness, which is a term that's used for a diversity approach where group identities and differences are downplayed. So statements like, inclusion is about everyone, which of course it is, but by saying these things we might overlook the historical inequalities that are there along identity lines. So there really is this focus on homogeneity, and assimilationism even goes further by really compelling people from minoritized groups to adapt to dominant group norms, also implying negative evaluations of minoritized group differences. And this can, of course, hurt sexual minority identity, people with sexual minority identities, and leads them to not disclose these identities, as they have to change themselves to better fit this idea of the professional as straight and cisgender. That in turn then leads to a spiral of silence. So there is already the idea that we shouldn't be speaking about this, that it would be irrelevant to the workplace, so people stop from disclosing, which makes it even seem more irrelevant, right? Because apparently it's not a topic that is discussed, and therefore that should be discussed. So we see this, for example, in the dissertation research of Hao Zhou, who is one of the people with the microphone, and who will also be at the coffee and tea break, so you can also ask her questions, and the organizer of the symposium. And what she shows is that LGBT plus individuals, compared to their heterosexual counterparts, experience greater conflict between their sexual identity, for example, as a lesbian, and their work identity, for example, as a teacher, more than non-LGBT plus people, and they're also more likely to avoid disclosing their identity in the workplace. This in turn is related to worse workplace well-being, like lower job satisfaction, lower felt inclusion, which we know has negative downstream consequences for performance, for turnover intentions, etc. Now, some groups within this community, the LGBTIQ plus umbrella, may be particularly affected by heteroprofessionalism. And we looked at one such group, by plus people, that I already talked about a little bit, in collaboration with B+ Nederland, an advocacy and research association, an NGO, where we interviewed people about their experiences at work, by plus people, and we also surveyed the literature to see what do we actually know about this particular group. Because what we see in the Netherlands, at least, is that by plus people tend to be worse off in the workplace than heterosexual people, but also than lesbian and gay people. And this came up so often that even the ministry was concerned about this. It came up so often in research by, for example, SAP, our Social Cultural Planning Bureau, that they asked us to do research on this. And we did so in a qualitative way by interviewing people. So this is what the previous research shows. There is more unwanted behavior against bi plus people at work, and also bi plus people tend to be less open than their colleagues about their sexual identity at work, which really leads to invisibility. So in this interview study, what we, in a nutshell, found is that the particular barrier is actually this combination of heteroprofessionalism, this idea that to be professional is to be neutral, and that means to be straight, combined with the monosexual norm, so the expectation that people would like a person of a gender and not be attracted to people of different genders. So this idea that, for example, if you share as a woman that your partner is woman, then you would be considered a lesbian. And then it feels awkward to be like, well, actually, yes, I'm with a woman, but I also like men or non-binary people. And so it becomes this strange conversation. And that and other things came up in the research, and you can read more about it in the report that's in the corner there, and there is a summary of it also in English. Now, a lot of work on heteroprofessionalism has been from the gender studies literature, not so much from social psychology or sociology. And it has mostly focused on the experiences and the narratives shared by LGBTIQ+ people themselves, and not really about the perceptions of the broader samples, including heterosexual people. And we wanted to know in House dissertation how it plays a role in people's perceptions of sexual orientation disclosure. And so we looked very simply in experiments how people view the professionalism of people who either share their identity at work or do not share their identity at work. And we also looked at whether individual differences in people's attitudes towards LGBTIQ+ people exacerbated these effects. So we ran a study, and through this I will go very quickly, where we showed a vignette, a little story about a gay male person who shared or did not share his identity, and the half of the sample saw one condition and the other half the other. Here's the text. I will share the slides so you can read this later. And then they answered questions about their impressions of this person, including professionalism questions. And what we find is that indeed, in the condition where he was set to disclose his sexual orientation, he was seen as less professional than when not. Here we didn't see a difference between people who are more or less negative about LGBTIQ+ people and issues, but we also had not a very varied sample on this. So we did another study, a bigger study, and also including people along the political spectrum, hoping to find more variety in this individual difference variable. Here we had about the same manipulation. There were a few small changes. And we also asked how moral, how competent, and how sociable they thought the person was. So we broadened our impression questions. And we measured to what extent people were interested in cooperating with the person in the vignette, both in a formal, work-related way or directly work-related way, and an informal way, like, for example, going to lunch with the person or sharing private information. We tested the same effects as in study 1, and we indeed found very interesting results. So one of the things we found is that disclosure actually did lead to greater perceived morality. So there was a positive effect on how moral the person was thought to be, presumably because not sharing or being said not to share makes people think that you're hiding something, so it makes you look immoral or insincere. But we also replicated the effect from the first study, that they perceived them as less professional. So we really here see this double-edged sword, where on the one hand there is increased morality, on the other hand there is decreased professionalism, and interestingly, the morality path led to more willingness to informally collaborate with the person, whereas the professionalism path led to reduced willingness to formally cooperate. So this really suggests also that the concerns that LGBT+ people have about sharing their identity at work are well-founded, and they have to sort of balance these two possible consequences, and I'm sure there are many more, right? We focused on these. We also found in this study that it was exacerbated by individual differences in heteronormativity. So the more negative people were towards LGBTIQ+ issues and people, the stronger these effects were, especially for professionalism. Now, what can organizations do? I think this is very much aligned with what Erin was already talking about. You really need to change the narrative. and change this implicit norm of heteroprofessionalism, for example, being explicit about the disclosure of sexual orientation being normal, or at least having an opinion about this and sharing this broadly. In terms of more specific policy measures, last year I presented some work by another PhD student in our lab, Jojanneke, who will be moderating the next session, where we focus on identity-conscious efforts, things where you really make explicit that LGBTIQ plus people are included in the workplace and that their issues should be addressed, like employee networks, for example. Now, we also know from this BI+ research that a general LGBTIQ plus approach doesn't work for every subgroup, and that it's important to really point out the issues, but also the solutions that are specific for specific subgroups within the community. More recommendations can be found on the Workplace Pride website. In terms of the BI+ inclusion research, we even have a practical handout that's also available in English that you can download from the website of B+ Nederland. And hopefully use in your own workplace. Now, colleagues and supervisors, what can they do? Also change the narrative. What I really think is important is to talk about what do we actually think is professional? Who is the ideal worker here? Who is the Leiden University employee, right? And of course, there's not one, but by talking about this, what is the thing that we value? What are these aspects? And what do we think in terms of sexual orientation? At least we can become more aware of what these implicit assumptions are that we make. So the question is, what actions are you committing to take? And I think we can talk about that more later and maybe pledge to each other what we will do. But I do want to leave enough time for Jojanneke. So I'm ending this now, but do come find me to critique or ask questions about this research. Thank you. So Jojanneke is now almost a household name, I think, in the organization of this Workplace Inclusion Symposium, because he does this every year in a really nice way. So thank you very much for doing so. And I'll leave the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, both Erin and Jojanneke, for those talks. We thought always at the end of the symposium to hear from practitioners in the field on how this is happening, what their experiences are like. So I'd like to call on stage our panelists, Pascal, Rose, Melati, and also Erin, if you could also join us.
See, we like each other. Cozy, right?
Well, maybe to start with, I think, starting from Pascal, if you could all introduce yourselves, what you do, and so everyone else also has an idea of where your insights come from.
Yes, so hello everyone. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It was very inspiring. I'm a very curious person, so always happy to get new insights, and I'm already thinking about what we are going to do different within our organization. So I work for Avery Dennison. It's an American corporation, but we have our headquarters here in Leiden, close to the Corpus. And I lead global innovation, R&D, and sustainability. So I have a lot of teams from different cultures around the world. And I have been asked a couple of years ago to share our D&I network here our effort here in the EMENA region. And I sponsor our Empower ERG, which is a woman ERG, and also the LGBTQI+ for our company here in Europe. So yes, I was very inspired. You want me to continue, maybe, to explain a little bit what we do, or you want?
Yeah?
Okay.
Also, if you based on the talks,
Yes.
so people are like, from the talks we heard, if there's something that resonated with you, or yeah.
Yeah, no, and I'm in STEM, so definitively a lot of stuff resonated with me. But I have to say, by the way, I mentioned this to Martin, that is leading our D&I, and here in Europe. This morning I was mentioning that, yes, a couple of years ago we had in our headquarters, organized by AMCAM, a D&I discussion, and there was really someone from IBM that made me reflect a lot, and this is where we started I think, to think about our journey differently. A lot of the D&I was very much pushed by North America, our corporation, and I was kind of feeling there is a cultural clash. D&I in North America doesn't mean the same in China, in Europe, and this is where we started our chapter. And the first thing we did was to say, hey, we don't know what we don't know. Let's ask the employee and let's listen to them. And I think that very quickly we realized, well, in North America at that time, the discussion about black and color and people of color, etc., was a big deal with George Floyd. In Europe, LGBTQI and handicap was probably coming first. And I had to say something for the people here eventually that want to start in their journey. I was a little bit biased because at the time we had a lot of employee resource group in North America. And in Europe, when I was asking the question to our employee, in particular here in Netherlands, the people was, why we want to be between women? Or why we feel we need to be all together and we don't need to feel cluster. So I was a little bit with this mindset, but we forced ourselves, I remember with Martin, to say, no, let's try and let's create this ERG, because these people in this community may feel a more, an environment, a psychological safety environment where maybe they are more happy to talk, they can create the awareness, and they can really know what is important. And this is where we create our ERG for women and LGBTQI+ as a first step. And I have to say I'm very proud, because I think we did a bunch of right stuff. We did a survey, we changed a lot of policies, but from the people that know what are the problems they face on a day-to-day, not from HR, but really helping HR to understand what our employees face, what do they need to do differently, how we change the payroll, how we change the policy, how we bring a playbook, how we help managers to understand how they need to behave differently. I heard the global benchmark. We started 4 years ago, 25%. Today we are at 73.6%. So we are extremely proud, but we are always thinking about improving ourselves. And I got quite some ideas here. In particular, what has been mentioned about we should not treat LGBTQI+ maybe in the same way. Maybe there are differentiation. I think it's very important. But what I have to say is that creating this has built awareness in the organization. And I think what I'm most proud is that some people didn't have the courage to come out, and more when they see us, when they are going to see me go back with Martin with a picture explaining what we did today, they are going to find the courage to come and to come out and to help us to move the journey.
Thank you so much, Pascal. I'm going to move on to then Melati also, if you could introduce yourselves and reflect on the talks you'd heard today, if there's something that resonated with you.
Hi, well, I'm Melati Tamsma. I work for Kite Pharma, which is a company that takes the blood from cancer patients and turns it into their medicine. I actually work with this material, but I am also the lead of the gender equity pillar within our inclusion team. I'm actually quite intrigued by what you were saying about creating these ERGs, because one of the things that I've been seeing is that a lot also gets lost when we don't speak the same language, because we spend 80% of our time trying to explain what we're trying to convey before we can get to trying to actually achieve anything. And I think one of the strengths within KITE that we see within our inclusion organization is that the people who are in the inclusion team, those pillars are people who are in those groups, in those who hold those identities themselves, and are not just chosen from the top ranks of the organization as a sidestep, but also very much are people from within the entire organization, which they are then offered access, invited into rooms where leadership makes decisions, and to actually speak with that lived experience, which gives a very sincere movement within the company.
Thank you. Then I'll move on to Rose. If you could also introduce yourself and yeah.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. My name is Rose. I work as a DEI officer for TNO. It's a research organization here in the Netherlands, also in STEM. I've been in this role for I think about 9 months now, so pretty new to the organization. Much of recognition, what both of you said, and coming from social sciences, honestly, I was a little bit shocked. You can call me naive, I'm not sure. A little bit shocked at what I found in the organization when it comes to putting that stress on being objective, always. That's a conversation I have every week. Like every week, I face that type of resistance, which I find is sometimes really, really, really hard, because the question that comes with that is 9 out of 10 times when I tell what I'm here for and what I think we can improve, and what I specifically think individuals at our organizations can improve, in addition to working on the policy side, of course. I nearly always get the question, that's very good and interesting, and I'm all for equality and everything, but where do we draw the line? Mm-hmm. That's a question that says a lot about resistance. And I think that's super interesting here when I saw your list of what can we do, and also Jojanneke, your advice. I take a lot from that, because I just need, in terms of TNO language, I need munition to really fight those questions. And sometimes I just feel like answering, well, we draw the line at cisgender white male. Of course, I don't say that, but I try to really switch that question and say we draw the line at discrimination, racism, sexism. That's what we don't do. But then, of course, people feel a bit offended to have an answer like that. So that's just something that I really, and you can feel it in your body every time you have that conversation, right? So I'm very happy that it's part of the research that you do. And on top of that, what I think is interesting, Jojanneke, what you mentioned, is in the line of identity blindness, the spiral of silence, which I think is still an issue at our organization. We have a very active employee resource group. Tara Tanking is here, who is actually an active member of that group. Rainbow at TNO, super active, also collaborating with the other ERGs, which I think is very important. But I think that you also recognize when I say that there is definitely a lot of silence still in the organization. And we do need to find ways to fight that. So that's it for now.
Thank you so much. Speaking of drawing the line and also drawing from Jojanneke's representation about the line between what's professional and what's cisgender, heterosexual, and white, and that was maybe, Melati, have you sort of experienced this in your own career, or how have you dealt with these considerations?
I look like this, so very much white woman who also does not necessarily immediately get clocked as queer. And it used to be that kind of put me in this stealth position where people would speak rather openly about their opinions, generally not their positive opinions. And I would feel rather conflicted around that, because at that point you feel even more explicitly unsafe to speak up and share your identity. So these days I kind of throw myself into the deep end, and if you have met me and talked to me for more than 5 minutes, you are probably not going to be making similar statements anymore. But that does also mean that I'm excluding myself sometimes from spaces where I might be able to convince somebody of something because I am considered a more palatable other. And that is sometimes something that I also feel a responsibility towards, because people have an easier time listening to somebody that does not challenge their notions as much. And given all the privilege that I hold with my whiteness, with my femme-presenting self, sometimes I almost feel a little bit like I'm escaping that, being as confrontational as I am about what I believe and what I stand for.
I think that's a very thoughtful response, and I also think, harkening back to the previous symposium, like the use of your own privilege to make headways. And then I think on the same topic, maybe Pascal, if you can elaborate on how you've dealt with in your championing the ERGs and D&I in this line of professionalism and identity disclosure, or being authentic to who you are, and so on.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of situations, and what pops to my mind is that despite all the efforts that we are doing, and despite trying to create this tolerance, etc., we know in the organization there are pockets where there are different opinions. And I was thinking culturally, we have countries when we celebrate some journey, or we know some countries are reacting very, very differently. And I'm thinking about Poland, Turkey, Romania has been countries where the culture is very different, and we don't have all the answers ourselves. I think what we did in that case is we reach out to local organizations. And by the way, the reason at the beginning we wanted to be part of and member of Workplace Pride was also because we wanted to get insights. But what we realized is that connecting the people there that has a specific, sometimes is very cultural. It's not just about professional or opinion. It's very anchored in the culture. And I think that asking help from local organization that knows the culture in the country has been a way for us to continue to progress in these small pockets. I think we need to continue to build on awareness every day.
And I think also that these cultures within these places very strongly influence what is needed. Erin, you mentioned the queerness as a sin, so LGBTQ, the religion aspect. In the Netherlands, I don't believe we have as strong of a majority Christian culture. What we have seen in the past is that politicians have used almost the liberation of queer people as a method to further their agendas of discrimination towards people from other cultures. For example, people use it to discriminate against people from Muslim cultural backgrounds, with the idea of, oh, you gay people should not want these people in your country because it will put you in danger. Whilst at the same time, these are far-right politicians who usually would have no interest in furthering the agenda of LGBTQ plus people. However, when it serves them, and then it becomes very difficult to disentangle those two aspects, and the only way that I've seen that helps is kind of standing together then and speaking with each other and on behalf of each other's rights.
Yeah, thank you. I think it brings up a very important point of intersecting identities and standing together in diversity, not just focusing on these specific groups, but intersectionally and sort of all together. All these groups need to support each other in a way. And I guess going off the Rose, your work as a D&I officer, how do you view this? How does this happen at TNO in supporting these different groups together? How these groups come together?
Yeah. Well, we have quite active employee resource groups. We have Rainbow at TNO, Women at TNO, Neurodiversity, and we have cultural diversity. I'm very happy that they're there. They've been there for a few years, Neurodiversity being the newest one. And since I've been in, I've tried to increase their collaboration with each other, to really focus on the intersectionality, because I think that's really something that is not very common at TNO, at least. I'm not sure how it is in other STEM organizations. I'd be very interested though. But when I came, actually in my job interview, I asked about, what is already in place and what are the most important focus areas at the moment when it comes to DEI. And it was very clear. They said, well, there's two things that are on the agenda. One is more women, specifically in higher positions. Didn't even talk about gender equality. It's about women, which is still quite of a discussion.
Very recognizable.
Oh, yeah. And then the other thing is making sure that our internationals feel more included. So it's very much women versus men and very much Dutch versus non-Dutch employees. A very one-dimensional approach, a very limited approach to diversity, which is also quite of a struggle, especially in higher management, to get that focus to a broader perspective. And they were asking for numbers, and then it comes to self-identity and how do you report on that? And it's really, they just want the numbers, and that's really quite hard to deal with, because men, women, so male, female, easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's like compared to other things, it's easier.
More known.
Yeah, and then when I talk about intersections, they go like, well, do you have numbers on that? I was like, no, I don't. So that's really quite difficult. But together with the ERGs, who are, I think, talking to each other more and more, and also organizing different things together. So also to show to our employees, hey, we do see that everybody is an intersection and that there are specific intersections in the organization that we know have a harder time. So we need to pay attention to that. But it's hard to take that to the higher management level, honestly. Yeah.
No, I recognize that very much. We've also currently got a focus on improving female leadership. And when it was brought up that, hey, but how about transitioning that to non-male leadership, to make that a bigger group? There were two main responses. Yes, but how can we make that statistically relevant? With our systems not allowing for self-identification, etc., and then purported small groups, but also very much, yes, but intentionality. So we don't want to lose the driving force by spreading our interest to, whilst losing that, if you lift everybody up, you will move women up as well. And that can be tricky, and it really means having to convince people in those positions to make those choices, make them see the value in it. And that can sometimes take a few extra steps.
I want to raise something quickly around sort of intersectionality in the context of ERGs that I think is important, and that has to do with the particular kind of quality of LGBTQIA inequality, and that is that it often requires status management in a way that other types of disadvantaged identities don't. So because it's not often immediately recognizable. It's something that people have to negotiate, right? When if I meet a new faculty member that's in my department, when and how do I tell them I'm queer? And under what context? When do I feel safe to do that? And it's not just being out, right? I think we tend to talk about outness as the benchmark, but it's really about the maintenance of that status. When do I raise it? How often do I tell people about my experiences that I had this weekend over this, this new date that I had or something like that, right? And remind people of my status. That's really important to integrate into the conversations about ERG, but also within the context of intersectionality, recognize that outness itself is culturally contingent, right? There's some intersecting groups for whom being out in the workplace and maybe the threat of that expanding out to family members is personally threatening and problematic culturally or familially. So making sure that we are not taking outness as the gold standard against which everyone is trying to move up to is really, really important in that dialogue and in that space.
Yeah, because I think you see that in the workplace very much, that for some people they really need to know that you are a safe space, and generally speaking that means showing them either already through something else that you know how to respect their discretion, or that you can very much identify with it before they are willing to share that part of themselves. And then you are in that position where, for me, that feels like such a compliment of trust, and at the same time I do still have to deconstruct I wish there was a way for you to be able to share that more easily, because that is not my want to have, but it is still something that it took me a while to come out. And for me, that did a lot, which I need to remember that, my perspective is not always everyone's perspective, and that is not always what means most to everyone, but it can be tricky.
Thank you so much for that. And important point, yeah, outness is also not a binary thing. It is a constant ongoing process. But I think looking at the time, I fortunately don't have time for questions, but there is coffee and tea, so I'm sure you can ask questions then. But then I'll give the floor to Michael.
All right. I can be brief because I said lots of the things already at the opening, so that's excellent. And I see also it's very small. I can look bigger. I cannot read it. Anyway, so academia at Workplace Pride. So we have many different communities at Workplace Pride, and academia is one of them. And of course, what do we want to achieve here? We want to contribute to the academic and research workplaces so that everybody, staff, students, faculty, have a sense of belonging, can be themselves. And we also want to acknowledge that the academic and research organizations are pretty unique. They're a little bit different from the average commercial organization or the average government organization. And we work very closely with Jojanneke from the Toorn. We're very happy to have her as our chair already in your second term, right? Or 5 years, so. Words are great, but activities are even better. So I quickly give you a bit of a flavor of what we did last year. We had a company visit. We went to TU Delft to see diversity in building. I see the TU Delft people are very excited. We had a round table at our International Workplace Pride Conference. This was all about creating braver and safer spaces in academia. It was very interesting, by the way. We worked together with intersectionality at work with women at Workplace Pride. And this was the power of women in the age of super diversity. It's a super title. Of course, last year we had our symposium and opening of the academic year right here. Then in October, there were all kinds of activities around coming out. We were present, but maybe not as present as we liked, at the Impact Awards Gala, which was in the Scheepvaartmuseum. Great party, and where we celebrate, of course, the great outcome of the Workplace Pride Global Benchmark. And in December, we did something together with Tech at Workplace Pride, Young at Workplace Pride, around Purple Friday. So this year, we actually started a small core team, and I see it was so core that I don't see any of the representatives here, but they are from the University of Utrecht, de Hogeschool in Utrecht, Saxion and TU Delft, and I'm very happy that those people are there supporting and working together with me. We were present, of course, at our international conference in The Hague, talked about neurodiversity, which was also a theme that came up this morning here. I was very fortunate to write a opinion piece together with Jojanneke, and it was around BI+. And of course, BI+ is a bit of a theme here, and we can still celebrate BI+ downstairs in the great exhibition afterwards. We are here today, and then coming up is coming out. We are working on an event together with Young at Workplace Pride, and I think the HEMA will be one was going to host it, so super excited. I know that other academia at Workplace Pride members have their own events. Delft is going to be there, Twente, Saxion, and at the end of this year, we will work again with Student Pride on an event for Purple Friday. Now, we asked you last year, what do you want on the agenda? So this year, of course, we have our events, this academic year next year as well. But the central theme, I think, what we would like to put on the agenda is how can we stimulate the Workplace Pride global benchmark among members of academia? So that there is better uptake, but it's already very good. I think almost half of the members of academia at Workplace Pride, the organizations, have started on the benchmark, but also how to kind of learn from each other and improve the scores over time. Now, one of the things specifically you told us that you would like to see on the agenda are discussions around self-ID, around rainbow families, and maybe something more about dedicated HR session. This, of course, fits perfectly under the umbrella of the global benchmark because they are really some of the key items on the global benchmark. So that is it from me. And then I would just say before I hand over to Jojanneke, our sister community, Women at Workplace Pride, they are looking for new leaders. So if you feel like you want to commit to that, and it's open to everybody. There's an email address here, or come to me or to Christine, and be committed there as well. Thank you so much. And now I give the floor to Jojanneke to kind of wrap it all up.
I think we are ready for a break, but I do want to acknowledge the people that were organizing today, and especially my PhD students, Shuttich Moore, Hao Zhou, and Paula Hoffman. Talk to them. They're the next generation of researchers on LGBTIQ+ inclusion. They will also be looking for work at some point. They're now still working very hard with me, but they will be looking for a job. So please enjoy the network session, the portrait exhibition, and I hope to see you again next year. Thank you.